The parable of the Good Samaritan is so well known that many people think they know exactly what it means, which probably puts us in the shoes of the teacher of the law, whose question prompted the parable in the first place. I think we can assume that when he asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbour?" he thought he was on pretty safe ground. He would have been thinking to himself, "I take good care of my neighbours." That is, the good Jewish people who live in my area, my neighbourhood. But Jesus' reply expanded the term neighbourhood well beyond his view. At that time, no love was lost between Jews and Samaritans. The Samaritans thought themselves as Jewish, but their centre of worship was at Mount Gerizim rather than Jerusalem. And so Orthodox Jews considered the Samaritans not only to be heretics, but also to be foreigners and to be ceremonially unclean. But this teacher of the law knew his scripture very well. And when Jesus asked him, "What does the law say?" he quoted from Leviticus chapter 19, "You shall love your neighbour as yourself." But he ignored the verses that were in our scripture reading today that come just a few verses later, that says, "Do not mistreat foreigners who are living in your land. Treat them as you would fellow Israelites, and love them as you love yourself. Remember, you were once foreigners in Egypt." That's just one of the society laws that you find in the book of Leviticus. But it means that God has created all people, and concern for all people breaks down tribal or national barriers. But the teacher of the law wanted to know exactly or precisely what all this meant. He wanted to know, how far do you have to go in this responsibility to love your neighbour? Where do you draw the line? What are the limits? You can't love everyone, can you? And so Jesus told him a story about a caring Samaritan and an indifferent or unconcerned priest and Levite. But the question that Jesus asked him after the story, which of the three do you think proved himself neighbourly to the one who fell amongst the thieves? That question shifts the attention to the kind of person who is neighbourly, rather than who is or who is not my neighbour. And the people who first heard the story were shocked, because it said that the hated foreign Samaritan was the one who proved himself neighbourly. And Jesus was saying then and now that neighbourliness is not just an idea that we can agree with. It's a loving action that we get involved in. And the test of our neighbourliness is what we actually do, not what we think or say, but what we actually do. And Jesus' story tells us that he wants us to prove ourselves neighbourly by acting with that same sort of love that we see in the actions of the Samaritan. Love that knows no boundaries and seeks no reward. And Jesus was teaching that our neighbourliness is determined by being like the God that we worship, who is loving and caring and merciful to all. But to put it in a local context, in Melbourne today, we're often surrounded by Australians who may have been born in another country, who may speak another language apart from English, who may have a slightly different skin colour, and who may even call God by a different name. And unfortunately, as a country, we have had pretty much a history of not being very neighbourly towards newcomers and perhaps First Nation Australians, especially those who were caught up in the stolen generation, where Aboriginal children were taken away from their parents and left with a life of trauma and never treated as equal. Or perhaps we can think back to the White Australia policy. I remember well that a bit over 58 years ago, Marilyn and I encountered the White Australia policy when we announced our engagement in the newspapers. And in the next couple of days, while I was away on a home mission appointment at Elmhurst and Crowlands and Warwick, the immigration officials arrived in the dead of night to forcibly deport Marilyn, even though she had a lot of time left on her visa. And I'm sure it would have happened if it wasn't for a good Samaritan lawyer who lived next door and who saw what was happening and came and intervened. And as I walk around the Glen Shopping Centre, now I see a very multicultural society that we're part of. And our nearest neighbours, on one side, we have Chinese Christians from Singapore. And I remember that the parents, before they went home, came and saw me and gave me their phone number and their email address so that I could be in touch if there were any problems. And in front, we have a family from Sri Lanka who spend as much time in their temple as we do at our church. And they're the loveliest neighbours and the best friends that you could imagine. And I'm also encouraged by the friendly interaction of the multicultural group that I'm part of at the swimming pool on a lot of early mornings. Jesus holds up the foreign Samaritan's loving, caring behaviour. He holds it up as an example and teaches us that to love our neighbour as ourselves, we must reach out beyond our national or tribal barriers. For our neighbours are the people all around us who need our help. And Jesus' story is saying and showing in the action of the Samaritan that this is how we will prove ourselves neighbourly. This is how we will act when we're following Jesus and share his vision of life in the kingdom. Life where God calls us to love without limits or boundaries, because that's what God is like. God who so loved the world that he gave his only Son. And Jesus holds up the Samaritan's loving, caring action. And he says to us, go and do likewise. Amen.